sound like now it sounds like it's on, doesn't it? Okay. For those of you who you may get uncomfortable on the floor, there are seats around here. If you want to sit, if you're comfortable where you are, fine. If there's not going to be a quiz, if you want to come up, those of you who are just coming in, I'm not going to call on anybody. Well, I might. Let's see. Well, thank you for having us here. I'm very glad to have so many of you join me this evening. I am traveling across the country and campuses, principally college and university, but we've also hit some high school campuses, talking about an action on April 22nd, the Emergency Action for Women's Lives in Washington, D.C. And I'll be addressing that here tonight. Also, of course, since I'm on a college campus, I think a lot about what the world was like when I was in college and when I was first in the waged workforce. So I want to touch a little bit about that, a little bit on the progress and some of the challenges that we're facing, and then how you can get involved, what your role can be. Because if you can't come to Washington on April 22nd, you don't get off the hook. But I hope you will. I guess I have to say that when I first was going into the waged workforce in this country, and it wasn't a million years ago. I got out of high school in '62, out of undergraduate school in '66, and then I went to law school from '72 to '75. In between, I was a stewardess for Pan Am in an era when we were stewardesses. We were not flight attendants. But when I first entered into the waged workforce after high school, people still argued with a straight face that women did not need or deserve equal pay for equal work, and no law required it. That's in my adult lifetime. When I first went to work for Pan American, and it was a wonderful job actually for a young woman from a small town in Indiana who hadn't seen much of the world. It was I've often said that experience as a flight attendant radicalized me more than any other single experience. I spent 7 years walking up and down airplane aisles, taking people's garbage and thanking them for it. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I guess that's, that experience is part of what makes me so passionate now about saying we are not going to take any more of their garbage in Washington, and thank them for it, okay? That's over. But when I started, it was an era when we were not flight attendants. It was overwhelmingly a women's job. In fact, Pan Am was the one who got sued to require them to hire men. They actually had the audacity to argue in court that they had that requirement because the passengers were more comforted by the maternal presence of women on the airplane if they were afraid to fly. Now, mind you, if you actually were maternal, that is, if you were married and especially if you got pregnant, you were fired. So that argument didn't fly very well with the court, and they required them to hire men as well as women. I'm sure that you know that the reason they required us to retire at age 32, or when we got married, whichever came first, was out of the interest of the safety of the flying public, right? I mean, I'm sure that's what it was. You want young, vigorous flight attendants to be able to get that 125-pound life raft out of the overhead compartment, out over the wing, inflate it and evacuate the airplane upside down underwater in the dark in 90 seconds. I'm sure that's what it was about. I'm sure it had nothing to do with the ad campaigns that the airlines were running, like Continental's "We really move our tails for you," or National Airlines, "I'm Cheryl, fly me." To which some of my colleagues responded by making buttons that said, "Fly yourself." We have to have some sense of humor after all, because otherwise we'd have to blow something up, and that would be wrong, all right? And yet at the time, we didn't even have the words sexual harassment to describe the behavior that kind of advertising encouraged. And no law recognized it as illegal job discrimination. So I've seen a lot of progress if we only look on the economic front. I mean, huge progress. And I guess I want to tell that to you in part because I want to encourage your activism and encourage you to understand that progress is not equality. We're not there yet. Progress is not irreversible. We can get pushed backwards. And progress is also something that doesn't come about because we have a few good elected officials in the Congress or the court or the White House, but because we have strong movements that demand change. And that's what has made the progress, and that's what will continue protecting the progress and moving us forward. I do have to tell you another story, because I want to talk tonight about family planning, about birth control, abortion, about the right to be free from coercive use of birth control, because we have seen efforts to impose Norplant and some other forms of birth control on poor women. So we want to talk about reproductive freedom, the right to choose birth control and abortion, the right to choose to have and raise our children. But when I was first getting married, and I got married very young, I don't recommend it, but I got married at 17, and I was living in this small town in Indiana. My engagement had been announced in the local newspaper. It was not hard to make the style section of the local newspaper. It was only 20,000 people in the town, okay? And I took my mother with me for additional credibility when I went to the doctor to ask for birth control. And the doctor said, "Come back after the ceremony." I was not sure how that was supposed to work. We were going to exchange vows, go to the reception, swing by his office on the way to our honeymoon. Now I know that at that point in our country's history, birth control was illegal in some states, even for married couples. That's in my adult lifetime. That's when I'm getting married. Birth control was still illegal, even for married couples in some parts of this country. And while it wasn't illegal in Indiana, it was certainly not available or encouraged in any way. So I come from a history of knowing some of the problems with that would come with rolling back our reproductive rights. And I can tell you that at that time as well, that I was looking for family planning as I was getting married, that abortion was illegal in this country, and illegal abortion was the leading cause of maternal death. I know what it was like in an era of illegal abortion. I had an illegal abortion. I know who you went to. You went to the same guys who sold drugs on my college campus. They were the same people who ran the illegal gambling operation in the basement of the American Legion Hall in Knoxville, Tennessee. And they put you in touch with a man who was alcoholic and who performed abortions to pay his gambling debts. And I was lucky because I was not injured. But the same man did perforate a woman's uterus shortly after I had this illegal abortion. Fortunately, he had the integrity to at least drop her off at the emergency room on the way to the airport as he left town. And so to me, when we use the words pro-choice, I think we really minimize what we're talking about. We are talking about women's lives. And that's why we're talking about an emergency action for women's lives, because it is women's lives, it is women's health that are at stake. Women died, women were maimed and injured, and it can happen again. And again, I've seen that great change in our country's history, but all of that change is at risk. And indeed, I want to thank you also for getting me out of Washington, okay? I mean, it was a nice drive down here. It's a beautiful campus, and it's not Washington. What a treat. Having just been through the election that would never end, and I am a Miami-Dade voter, by the way. I don't know if my vote was counted. But, you know, those machines have to be cleaned every 8 years. No, I guess it's every year. The expert testimony in Florida was that to work properly, those machines have to be cleaned every time they're used and sprayed with silicone spray. The machines in Miami-Dade County had been used through 8 elections, primary and general elections, municipal elections, and then just for fun, they let the unions borrow them for union elections. Do you know how many times they've been cleaned in 8 years? 0. Never cleaned once. So I imagined, as I was hearing about it, trying to push that chad through, and you know, just all these chads were backed up in there. I mean, I had nightmares, but the election is finally over. We know that, and what we're facing is sort of startling for some of us. I mean, look at what's happened already. We've seen the rollback of the requirements to protect workers from the ergonomic standards, that is, to protect from repetitive motion injury. Well, it doesn't really matter if it's not you, and it's certainly not the members in the White House or the Congress who are facing that. And we've also, of course, now we know that CO2 is not really a pollutant, and the mining companies aren't going to have to clean up after themselves. And oh, and a little arsenic in the water, don't be so wussy, okay? I mean, we know that the arsenic is bad, we just don't know how bad and at what level, so we're going to have to study that some more. Oh, and while we're at it, we might have to log on the 60 million acres of federal forest and drill in the Arctic Circle, but don't worry about that. Oh, and let's see, besides ergonomics, one of the other, my favorites, because when I worked for Pan Am, what got me started in activism is that they did not provide the same benefits for the men and women who worked for them. And so if you were a man, you got health coverage that covered your entire family. If you were a woman, you got single-person health coverage. My husband needed dental surgery. I went to the Pan Am benefits office all expecting to be covered, and they looked at me like I was nuts. And they said, oh, no, we don't provide benefits for the families of women. Now, if you were a man, of course we'd cover your family, but we don't cover the women's families. Even I knew there had to be something wrong with that, and I wasn't a feminist activist by any means at that point. Now, how did I find now? They had been picketing at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commissions around the country. This was very early on. Title VII, the Equal Employment Opportunity part of the Civil Rights Act of '64, protected against employment discrimination against women, as well as employment discrimination based on race and religion and ethnicity. But the EEOC had made it very clear they were not going to enforce the law on behalf of women. They didn't see that as their mission. So now was picketing at EEOC offices, and in the spirit of the day, they'd actually invaded and taken over a few of the EEOC offices. I had seen their picture in the paper, so I knew where to find them. I knew where to plug in, and I called now, and they helped me fix the problem. And how did that come about? Because Pan Am was a federal contractor. They flew R&R for soldiers from Vietnam to Hawaii, and they also held maintenance contracts at Cape Canaveral for their machinists to work in the space program. Lyndon Johnson had just signed the executive order extending affirmative action to women. And so if Pan Am didn't want to put all of their federal contracts at risk, they were going to have to give me the same benefits for my family as they gave to the men. And that's what happened. I didn't even have to file suit. One call from the Labor Department, the next thing I knew, the supervisor who had told me no way was calling me and saying there had just been a terrible miscommunication. Terrible breakdown in communication. Of course, if I was the head of household, which I was because my husband was a student, then of course they would extend coverage to my family. Well, at first I thought it was just me and my family that had avoided another financial and medical disaster. But then one of the other married flight attendants came into the crew lounge one day when I was waiting for a flight, and she threw her arms around my neck and she said, wow, we won. And that we was such an incredible and important word to me, because by getting up my nerve and fighting effectively for something that I needed for myself and my family, I was able to change the policies of this global corporation for all of the women who worked there. And believe me, as a flight attendant, or as we were then known, stewardesses, it didn't seem like a particularly powerful and respected position in the society, but I was able to do that. And it felt good, and I wanted to do it again, and that's kind of where my activism grew and how I got plugged in with now. So you can imagine how viscerally it affects me when I hear that we're not going to require federal contractors to obey the federal law. You can now apply and get a defense or any other contract with the federal government with my tax dollars, your tax dollars, and be out of compliance with wage and hour, health and safety, labor laws, equal employment opportunity laws, no problem. And that's just in the first, what is it? We're not even to 100 days yet of the new administration. So there's lots and lots of areas where our progress is being threatened and where we have to draw a line in the sand and say, no, we're not going back there. So in light of all of these threats on environmental issues, workplace issues, union organizing, on all of the civil rights issues, look what happened in my state of Florida. I mean, it wasn't just the bad voting machines, but African Americans in particular, people of color in general, were denied their right to vote. Just flat out denied their right to vote. Jeb Bush, who's the governor of Florida, contracted, we have privatization of checking out the rolls for voting, where they were checking to see if people were convicted felons. And what they got back were lists that had not convicted felons, but everybody who'd been arrested even for a misdemeanor. They caught that and sent it back, and then it came back again, and they still had misdemeanor offenses on there, and people were denied their rights to vote. And now in Congress, oh, they're going to take care of that, no problem. They're going to have a special committee. But the House got into a big fight over who was going to be on the committee. And the Speaker of the House, Denny Hastert, said there should be 6 Republicans and 5 Democrats. And who is the Democrat who I'm thinking of, ranking Democrat, sort of blonde hair? Gephardt. Gephardt says, no, we have to have 6 and 6. It has to be an equal number. And because they couldn't decide how many of which party to put on there, they're not going to have a committee after all. So there's lots of things to worry about. So why are we focused on reproductive freedom? Why is it reproductive rights that we're organizing this march around for April 22nd? There's a number of reasons. First of all, it is fundamental. It is fundamental. It is a fundamental right for women to have that right to self-determination. It's a fundamental right that, to me, can't be separated out from in our politics any more than in the rest of our lives. So, for instance, I did a show today on the wage gap, which is now widening, in case you didn't know that. We closed the wage gap. 1980, it was about 59 cents on the dollar that women made in full-time year-round work for the dollar that men made. We closed it up to 75. I was still waiting for my other quarter. I mean, I was glad for the progress, but still waiting for my other quarter. Now it's widened again. It's now at 72 cents. This is the median wage. It's a gross figure. It's got no nuances, but the wage gap is widening. So I'm on television today, CNN and FN, and a guy from the Cato Institute is saying, well, it's not fair to say it that way. That's a phony number because you're not taking into account that women are mothers. Oh, I know that. You may have noticed women are the ones who get pregnant. And we are the ones who, by and large, care for the very young as well as the very old in our families. We're by and large the ones who care for the sick and the people with disabilities in our families. And I think it's a very valuable role, and I think we should honor that, but not just with lip service. It is one of the most expensive decisions a woman can make. And it is, in fact, where the wage gap widens, is between women with children in particular, that we have that huge gap. So, to me, the ability to plan and space your pregnancies, to decide whether and when to have children, also impacts on your work life. It impacts on your health. My great-grandmother had 12 pregnancies. It is hard on your body. And when women can plan and space our pregnancies, women are healthier, but infants are also healthier. You have less infant mortality and morbidity, which is a fancy way of saying you have fewer infants who get sick and who die because of low birth weight, because women who have pregnancy after pregnancy after pregnancy end up giving birth to infants who are not as strong. So it's a fundamental health issue, so it's a fundamental issue related to our ability to support our families and work, to have bread on the table and a roof over our heads and to pay for education. I say that because I know you all know it costs a bunch, or at least your parents know if you're not real clear, that it's an expensive venture to educate. And yet at the same time, there's again where the wage gap and wealth gap widens between the top and the bottom of our society, is over who has high school diplomas versus who has college degrees. But I think in terms of our self-determination and our freedom, the ability to be free from the interference of government in the most intimate areas of our lives, this is a fundamental right. Now, our opponents have been, in recent years, looking at, pointing all of our attention over here to late-term procedures, which they would call partial birth abortion. We would call an abortion procedures ban. And even that, I think, is it's a diversion, because what the law that was written said in Nebraska, for instance, they turned down an amendment to the law that would substitute the medical name for the procedure that they say they're targeting, and instead took this political term that they made up, partial birth abortion, and wrote a definition that is so vague, so ill-defined, that it could apply at any stage of pregnancy to any procedure. And that's not me talking, that's the United States Supreme Court. It is a law that was designed to break down any distinction between pre- and post-viability procedures, pre- and post-viability abortions. It also eliminates any exception for women's health. Now, Roe v. Wade, when it came down, said that states can outlaw late-term abortions. Post-viability abortions can be outlawed, and the majority of states already do outlaw them. But they have to make an exception for women's life and women's health. To me, women's health counts. This does not allow women's health to count. In fact, the United States Senate, when they considered the federal version that Clinton vetoed, specifically voted no on an amendment that would have said that you could use this procedure if the woman's health were threatened with severe injury to her physical health. And the Senate voted no. So to me, even that is a disingenuous portrayal. It's not a late-term procedure, it's all procedures, and it ignores women's health. But even if we say, okay, maybe there are folks who are legitimately and honestly concerned about that procedure, well, let's take off the mask for the rest of them, because now we're talking about RU-486. RU-486, as most of you know, is mifepristone. It's an abortion pill. It allows you to have an abortion earlier than a surgical procedure. You can have it very early. You can't have a surgical procedure as early as this, and because it's non-invasive, it's actually safer. But there comes the new administration, and there comes our new Health and Human Services Secretary, Tommy Thompson, and he announces in his confirmation hearings that we're going to review RU-486 for safety. Now, mind you, while they're saying this has been rushed through the Food and Drug Administration, which just approved it, it's been 12 years that it's been used around the world. 12 years, and literally hundreds of thousands of women have used RU-486. It is a very safe medical procedure. Mind you, we are not going to review Viagra for its safety. Men have died from using Viagra. Their hearts gave out. But we're not going to review that. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, there were reports on the paper, I don't know how many of you saw them, about a correlation. It's not been proven cause and effect, but a correlation with men using Viagra and going blind. Didn't their mothers tell them about that? I mean, but we're not going to review that safety. That's not at issue. RU-486 is at issue. Now, you can say, well, RU-486 is still an abortion. It's a medical abortion. It's much earlier, but it is still abortion. So then you have to go to our good friend John Ashcroft, who is now the Attorney General. John Ashcroft, of course, opposes abortion, even in cases of rape and incest and endangerment of the woman's health, but he also opposes some of the most effective and popular forms of birth control, because he thinks that an IUD, certain forms of birth control pill, the morning after pill, anything that works or might work, even in part by preventing a fertilized egg from implanting on the wall of the woman's uterus. That's how it gets nutrition. That's how it goes to be from a zygote to an embryo to a fetus, is that attachment, and that happens very early. It's the first week or 2 weeks. But anything that prevents that, IUD, birth control pills, morning after pill, he thinks is the equivalent of an abortion. So we're talking abortion, we're talking late, early, we're talking birth control, effective popular means of birth control. And in fact now, I just came back from Spartanburg, South Carolina. I spoke at Spartanburg Tech. They all think of you as Yankees up here, you might want to know, but just telling you. Spartanburg, I learned that just before I got there, their state legislature had voted to cut out family planning money for unmarried couples. There will be no state funding for clinics who give family planning information or devices to unmarried couples. Well, you know, and I know what that means, right? Unmarried couples in South Carolina aren't going to have sex anymore. I'm sure that's what's going to happen. Don't you think that's the result? Do you think it might be self-defeating or ironic that people who say they're opposed to abortion would also cut out family planning? Do I hear a little flashback from 1963 come back after the ceremony? on abortion, but also on birth control. And then if you think that it's just South Carolina and you're feeling safe here in Virginia, I wouldn't, by the way. Congress, the House of Representatives, passed in the last Congress and now has introduced again a bill that would require parental consent for birth control. Birth control, family consent, parental involvement for birth control. So it's not just late or even early abortion, it's birth control and it's young women's access to birth control, it's unmarried couples' access to birth control. And if you wonder whose rights are coming next, just look in the mirror. I mean, already the access to family planning and abortion has been limited for poor women, young women, any woman who depends on the federal government, whether she's a federal worker and her health coverage no longer provides full reproductive health coverage, or if you're in the military overseas and with your own money you can't use a military hospital to have an abortion even if your health is at risk, even if there's no other facility in the area that has adequate facilities, even if abortion is illegal in that country. Unless you've got the money to fly home, you've got a compulsory pregnancy on your hand. And just in case you think, well, maybe they could lobby and change the laws, not if they receive U.S. family planning funding, because the global gag rule prohibits any clinic, any health facility who gets U.S. family planning money from lobbying their own government to open up the laws. It would be unconstitutional if it were in this country. This from the man who said we're going to have a humble foreign policy. And we're imposing that on people whose democratic rights we usually say we support. So it's a very difficult position. Native women on tribal lands, women in federal prisons, all of those women have either lost totally or have lost realistic access to use and exercise their rights. All of that says to me that if we're not going to get pushed backwards, if we're not going to go back to the women dying again, we are going to have to really fight for our rights. And the only way that I know to do that is with grassroots organizing. I can be in Washington, I can fight as hard as I can, but if the members of the Congress in Virginia haven't heard from you all, I might as well not go to see them. If your senators don't hear from you all, I might as well not go to see them. And it's the senators right now that we really have to target. Yes, the House may pass this parental involvement for birth control. I don't think it's going through the Senate, but it worries me. But I'll tell you what is going to the Senate, and that is the next vacancy on the United States Supreme Court. And the United States Supreme Court right now is 5-4, 4-5 on so many issues. We lost part of the Violence Against Women Act, 5-4. We lost the Americans with Disability Act and Age Discrimination Act applying to states and state employees, 5-4. Equal Pay and the Family and Medical Leave Act are heading to the court with the same question. Do they apply to states and do they apply to state employees? And I worry about this court. On abortion rights, the court has already substantially limited Roe v. Wade. And I can tell you it's one of the few times I've agreed with William Rehnquist when he wrote in the dissenting opinion in Casey that Roe remains standing like the storefronts on a Western movie set, a facade giving the illusion of substance. But we've at least had the illusion, we've at least had some level of protection. Now, where do our rights stand at this point? It's very clear, if you haven't figured out, that what is protected by the Constitution depends on what the justices say is protected by the Constitution. And right now, 5-4, Sandra Day O'Connor is the deciding vote, and whatever she decides is an undue burden on women's right to reproductive freedom is what goes or stays in the law. So recently, a case came up out of South Carolina. It was a case restricting the facilities in which abortions could be performed. It restricted to the point that it made them basically have to be a small hospital. And it covered everything from bookkeeping practices to their air filtration system, and it allows the state to go in and seize private patient records. And with James Bopp just being arrested in France and charged with the murder of Dr. Slepian, the sniper attack shooting Dr. Slepian in his own living room in front of his wife and child on the one-year anniversary when he had just come back from Temple commemorating the one-year death of his father. I take it very seriously when patient records with names and all are stolen or lifted under the guise of law, under this South Carolina law. It went up on appeal. The trial court threw it out. The appellate court said it was okay with them. Now, mind you, if you want to go to South Carolina and get breast implants or liposuction, you don't have to meet these standards. It's only for abortion that an outpatient facility has to have these standards met and have their records subject to being seized. But the Supreme Court refused to hear it. And all over Washington, the tongues were wagging, saying, oh, the court, the anti-abortion rights justices do not want to hear another case on this topic until they have their fifth vote. And why are they thinking that they're going to have a fifth vote? Because all over Washington, everybody believes Sandra Day O'Connor is stepping down at the end of this term. That is in a matter of months. She will be gone if the rumors are true, and they're pretty consistent and come from some pretty well-placed people. She will be gone by July. If we wait until July to mount a pressure campaign, a campaign to mobilize the majority of people in this country who do not want Roe v. Wade overturned, and Gallup says it is 2/3, it's a 67% majority who do not want Roe v. Wade overturned, we better start now. Because I can tell you, you all know if Sandra Day O'Connor steps down, and she will at some point, and Justice Rehnquist can't be far behind her, President Bush will nominate, the Senate will confirm. This is a Senate that confirmed Ashcroft, who doesn't even believe in birth control. Do you think that lowers the standard a little? Do you think that makes Orrin Hatch look moderate? His name is out there. I am very concerned about what the court will do. Now, those of you who follow the court know that the Senate is now, the Senate who would vote to confirm or deny confirmation is divided 50-50. When they confirmed Ashcroft, it was a 58-42 vote. 42 negative votes is the highest number of negative votes ever for an Attorney General nominee. And significantly, it is enough to preserve a filibuster. If somebody gets the mic and starts filibustering, they can't be stopped unless there are enough votes against their continuing, and 41 votes is enough to continue. You have to have 60 votes to stop a filibuster. We got 42 against Ashcroft. We have got to strengthen the spines of the Democrats who voted against Ashcroft, because I have heard one of the very strong women's rights supporters, a guy in the Senate who we depend on, say that they think they have one wrecking ball with regard to the court. That means they think they can stop one nominee. And then they're going to have to fall into this go along to get along bipartisan, which means capitulate to what Bush wants. Now, I am old enough to remember Richard Nixon, and I know some of you here are. Nixon appointed Haynesworth and then named Haynesworth and then Carswell. The Senate turned them both down, and that's how we got Blackmun. Blackmun is the one who wrote the Roe v. Wade decision. It can be done. It must be done. Because otherwise, what's Bush got to do? If he hears the same thing I'm hearing, and believe me, if I'm hearing it, he's hearing it. My ear is no closer to the ground on the Senate than his is. That the Democrats think they have one wrecking ball. He's going to name Genghis Khan, and then he'll put through an Orrin Hatch. So they'll knock out Genghis Khan, they'll be straining themselves, patting themselves on the back, and then they'll put through another anti-abortion rights justice who will also be against us on our other issues. Now the Senate's split 50-50 right now. 50-50. All eyes are on Strom Thurmond. Okay, Strom Thurmond is 190 years old. I exaggerate by a factor of about 100. I think he's something over 96 is my recollection, but he's not well. And if he resigns, he's got 2 years left on his term. If he doesn't make it through the 2 years of his term, he will be replaced by the governor of South Carolina. The governor of South Carolina is a Democrat, Jim Hodges. Everybody's holding their breath. What will happen? Can Strom continue? Strom has not been seen in public except for one vote on the campaign finance bill where they thought, campaign finance reform, where they thought they needed him. They wheeled him out onto the floor, and he voted. Now myself, I'm thinking of Blackmun, who when he was very elderly told his clerks, when I die, just prop me up on the bench and vote for me. You know how I would vote, okay? And I'm thinking Weekend at Bernie's, and I'm thinking, I want a pulse check, okay? But the reality is that it's hard to imagine, except for his own strong will, that he's going to make it through the next 2 years. So all eyes now shift to Jim Hodges, the Democrat in South Carolina. The South Carolina legislature and even some folks in Congress are trying to see if they can come up with a bill that would be constitutional to require the Democratic governor of South Carolina to appoint a Republican to replace Strom Thurmond. That's how crazed this whole thing has gotten. That is also, though, why this is a very exciting time and why it's a critical time for you to get involved. We are at one of those points in history where you can actually help turn history around. You can change the direction of this Congress. There's a new book out about pandering by elected officials. And I was shocked because the conclusion that the two authors reached, they're both university researchers in political science, was that Congress panders less than they did 20 years ago. What do they mean by that? 20 years ago, Congress voted with the majority of public opinion about 60+% of the time. 20 years later, they are down to voting with public opinion about 40% of the time. And when they do all their polling and all of their focus groups, what they're trying to do is just what the commercial pollsters and focus groups are trying to do when they're trying to sell you laundry detergent. These guys are trying to sell you the position that they've already decided to take. They're not polling in their district to figure out how to vote. They're polling to figure out how to sell you. It's why Newt Gingrich came up here and started talking about welfare as being poor people's dependency on the government. You know, you shift the language, you shift. It's also why I think we have to talk about the women who died and tell their stories and not talk about pro-choice. I think that is a language that doesn't carry the concern that I feel about women and abortion rights. So all of this is going on. The court is up in the air. It is at stake. And I think that not only is this a fundamental right and the time for you to get active, but it's also a symbolic right. It's almost a metaphor for all of the fundamental rights that are under attack right now. The same people, the same religious and political extremists, the same elected officials who oppose reproductive freedom also oppose us on a whole array of other issues. The same violence is used against us, whether it is the harassment and intimidation at the clinics or the hate crimes that kill lesbians and gays, bisexuals and transgenders, or it is the hate crimes that goes after African Americans and other people of color. The same people who say all crime is hate crime and who refuse to acknowledge that there is a difference. If somebody burns a cross on my lawn, it is a different thing than if they burn a cross on an African American's lawn. I mean, there is a whole community impact. And yet we can't get the hate crimes bill expanded to cover women, to cover people with disabilities, to cover sexual orientation hate crimes. So it's the same cluster of people, the same cluster of issues, the same tactics that are used against us. We have an opportunity to use this action on April 22nd and this issue of reproductive freedom as a fundamental right to help build all of our movements. I know that there was a sweatshop organizer, an anti-sweatshop organizer on the campus here recently. I know that a lot of students have been involved in the globalization issue. And on Saturday in Canada, there is an action on the globalization, on the free trade of the Americas area. And some people will be going up there on Saturday and coming down to Washington for the abortion rights and reproductive freedom action on Sunday. Bless those people who can do both. But I think that it's also Earth Day, and there will be actions around Earth Day. These issues do interrelate. We know that women around the world have been more likely to control their own fertility if they have better access to education and employment. We know that injustice in globalization injures women more than any single group. We know that on Earth Day, there will be a lot of women in leadership, and we know that in this country, we use a disproportionate amount of the world's resources and create a disproportionate amount of the pollution. We have a lot of work to do, and I think we can build our movements across the lines that have traditionally separated us by movement, by race or ethnicity or background in a way that can strengthen all of us. And by doing that, can really turn this around. And so I hope a lot of you will take the drive up to Washington. It's a beautiful time of year there. Let's see, what else can I offer? You will be a part of a movement, because that's the other good news. There are people like us all over the country, and I think I've seen half of them, in small groups and large groups, who are committed not to being pushed back during this administration, who are committed not to allow the Supreme Court to be stacked with justices who don't believe in constitutional protection for our individual rights, who believe in states' rights, who don't want to have a national standard for civil rights, for women's rights, for equality. And we're the ones who can turn this around because we're part of a movement. I want you to think about what a difference you can make. You may be sitting there thinking, oh, what I do isn't going to matter. It's the Congress, it's the court, it's the culture. What you do does matter. It all adds up. And I want you to think, if you doubt for a minute that one person can make a difference, think about Rosa Parks, one of my favorite people in history. Rosa Parks, put yourself in that condition. You're down in the deepest of the deep South. It is the late 1950s, and you're on a bus. And the bus driver comes and tells you to get at the back of the bus because you're an African American. I didn't know until recently that there were 4 African Americans sitting on the bus that day. 3 of them got up and moved. Rosa Parks kept her seat. And by doing that, helped spark a movement that changed the course of this country's history, that did away with at least the legal segregation in our country. The other reason I want you to think about Rosa Parks when you doubt that you have an impact is because she wasn't truly alone. She was alone that day. It took great personal courage. It took her willingness to risk arrest. It took her willingness to put up with great social and peer pressure, and also the threat of real violence against her. And she kept her seat. But she was also part of a movement, even in the late 50s, even in the deepest of the deep South. There were organizers already there working for civil rights and equality. And they were ready to get people out of jail when they were arrested. They were ready to organize carpools so that people could go to church and to school and to the grocery store and to work without using the Birmingham buses. And by doing that, they changed our history, they changed our world. I would argue that they did change the world, and not just the United States. And so I want you to have the opportunity to be part of that kind of a movement, and to know that you have that kind of impact, and that everything you do is mirrored out from here, and that we will be kicking off this campaign. This is the beginning of a campaign. This is not the end. This is the beginning of a campaign as we move into this century. I want you to be a part of it. I don't want you to miss it. It's an enormously satisfying way to live, to be part of a movement. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is, how many close, deep friendships you will make with people who you work with on these issues. And you will have a purpose. Your life has meaning. I'm sitting here at 55 years old, and I hope that when you get to be my age, you will look back and not have to say, oh, I was just a quivering mass of protoplasm who lived and died. I want you to have a sense of purpose and meaning in your life, and this is a way to get involved. And I hope you will join us on April 22nd, and I hope you don't think for a minute that if you don't join us, it means you don't have to take action, because you do. There will be challenges here in Virginia. There will be challenges on your campus. It may be getting emergency contraceptive from the local pharmacy. It may be the morning after pill is unavailable to you. It may be any number of issues that are going to come up here in Virginia, here in your community, as well as in the Congress. And just as we began the 20th century by winning the right to vote, I want us to begin this century by pushing our rights forward. I don't want us to go backward, and I don't want any of us to feel as if we let it happen. You know, we didn't make any of the progress that we made. We didn't win equal pay. We didn't get sexual harassment recognized as illegal job discrimination. We didn't get the Supreme Court recognition of reproductive freedom. We didn't win the right to vote, first for African American men and then for all women, because we had elected officials, but again, because we had strong movements that demanded change. And as Frederick Douglass reminds us, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. And we're the ones who are going to have to continue making that demand for equality and for justice and for freedom. And I thank you very much for all that you're going to do to make it happen. Thank you.